Would one of you like to take over, Niyati or Ananya? Yeah,
I can do that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So,
audio or video, please send us a message.
Please go
Are
ahead.
you able to hear? Okay. All right. So next slide, please. Yeah. So as you all know, India's low carbon transition has the potential to create millions of new jobs, while it could also make some jobs obsolete. Therefore, it's important to ensure that the gains from a low carbon transition benefit everybody and leave no one behind. And this is especially true for India's women workforce. In today's webinar, we will examine the current gaps and needs of women in India's MSME sector and also explore how India's transition can be inclusive and create new and better livelihoods for the female workforce. To do this, we have an exceptional panel of speakers lined up. And so without any further ado, let me first invite Ms. Michelle Armstrong to provide us with her opening remarks. Michelle is the head of philanthropy and at Aries Management Corporation and an executive director of the Aries Charitable Foundation. She has immense experience in youth and education, nonprofit capacity building, and workforce readiness globally. With that, over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Ashwini. Thank you, and welcome to everyone who's had the opportunity to join us for today's webinar, which I am incredibly excited about. As Ashwini mentioned, my role is with the Aries Charitable Foundation to serve as executive director of the philanthropic arm of Aries Management Corporation. We are a leading firm in the alternative investment industry, but we are also equally committed to the concept of a just transition as well as to an inclusive and equitable economy. And one of the ways that we help to drive forward with those ideals is through the work that we execute through the Aries Charitable Foundation. As a firm, our core values are to be collaborative, to be responsible, to demonstrate an entrepreneurial spirit, to ensure that everything that we do allows us to be self-aware, and also to demonstrate the fact that we are highly trustworthy. And so the foundation and the grants that we award through the Aries Charitable Foundation, we believe allow us to demonstrate how we put our core values into action, particularly in the communities where we do business around the world, and also those communities where our team members live and work. Our mission as a foundation is to accelerate equality of economic opportunity. And we do that through three key funding priorities. We help people to prepare and to reskill for jobs. We also think about how we can help entrepreneurs to be able to launch and to scale their businesses with the intent that those businesses are also going to add economic value to the communities where they operate, including by helping people move into work. And then we also support initiatives that advance people's personal finance skills so that individuals are able to make smart, prudent decisions about how they not only acquire their fiscal capital, but also deploy it and save it. And our vision is a world in which people truly have access to the knowledge, the resources, and the opportunities necessary so that they can achieve their full potential. And I also want to point out that as a firm, we are very much committed to the ideals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as to ESG. And our philanthropy, I would say, really sits at the nexus of those ideals. It's through our philanthropy, including through our grant making, that we're able to partner with and to support like-minded, high-quality organizations like WRI that are willing to work with us to advance our ideals because they hold them very dear to themselves as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we are truly focused on the idea at Aries of a just transition as well as to an inclusive and equitable economy. And one of the ways that we are driving forward with those aspirations is through an initiative that we launched at the foundation earlier this year. We launched it in coincidence with Earth Day, and it's called Climate Resilient Employees for a Sustainable Tomorrow, or CREST for short. And actually quite serendipitously, CREST also, we spell out the word CREST with our core values as a firm that I highlighted earlier, collaborative, responsible, entrepreneurial, self-aware, and trustworthy. So quite serendipitous, not intentional, but again, the idea that through CREST that we are able to showcase the ways in which we are highly committed to helping to mitigate climate change, but primarily through our funding priority of career preparation and skilling. We recognize the global impact of climate change and the ways in which it is truly affecting every person from every walk of life. And concurrently, we recognize that business and industry have to play a very critical, salient role in helping to problem solve the crisis. So it's through CREST that we feel that we have been allowed the opportunity to work in concert with high quality organizations to help prepare and to reskill individuals for green jobs in India and the US. And we're so delighted to partner with WRI for the work that we're doing in India, and also with our partner Jobs for the Future, which is executing the work in the US. A primary goal that we have through CREST is not only to help prepare people for and to reskill them for green jobs, but also to disrupt occupational segregation. And what do we mean by that? We want to ensure that people who perhaps have been traditionally overlooked when it comes to moving into green jobs, particularly women, as well as people of color and people of lower socioeconomic status, have the opportunity to receive the training, to receive the reskilling, and to receive the support necessary to make that transition into good paying jobs that, again, are focused on how to help our economy focus more on green solutions when it comes to business and industry. And so I am going to pause here because I know that my friends at WRI are going to show a short video that provides an overview of CREST and what we intend to do. So Ashwini, if you could please play the video now, I would appreciate it.
Niyati, have you started the video? Just bear with us for a moment. Yes.
While we are waiting, I will point out that let me stop, I think the video is getting ready to start, so I'll come back to this. Thank you so much. I wanted to also point out that CREST for us is an opportunity to stay the course when it comes to helping people prepare and reskill for green jobs. It's a 5-year initiative, again, just launched this year. It's a $25 million investment by Aries Foundation, and what we believe is a highly critical and important challenge that we as a society and as a global economy need to rapidly address. I also want to point out the fact that at the Aries Foundation, we award 2 types of grants. We have our signature initiatives, which are very large scale, multi-year. CREST is certainly a key example of that. But then we also work in concert with our team members, our employees around the world, to direct much of the grant making that we do. And so I'm very delighted to also point out that we have a committee that is established in the Asia Pacific region that helps us to achieve our foundation mission and to drive towards our vision through other charities and other initiatives that we're able to fund that are more local and more regional. So truly the work that we're doing is not only global, but it also is intended to be highly regionally responsive. And we want to be responsive through CREST as well as through our employee directed grants that our team members help us to identify and to vet and to execute. So we are, again, truly delighted to not only deliver CREST in the region and to help support this concept of helping women and girls achieve a just transition, but we also look for ways that we can drive towards that goal through our employee directed grant making as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn things back over to our friends at World Resources Institute. But just to say thank you again for the opportunity, not only to participate in this morning's webinar, but also to partner with you over the next 5 years for what we know is going to be an incredibly impactful initiative.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for those remarks. It is now my pleasure to call upon Ms. Sharon Burrow to deliver the keynote address. Ms. Burrow is the former General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. She stepped down after 12 years at the ITUC World Congress in November 2022. Previously, she was the President of Australian Council of Trade Unions, ACTU, from 2000 to 2010. Sharon is well known for her international advocacy on labor standards, corporate responsibility, climate action with just transition, investment in infrastructure and green economy, investment in the care economy, women, equality and diversity, global migration and employment. It's truly an honor for us that you agreed to join us today, Sharon. Over to you for the keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashwini, and to all your team. In fact, I'm delighted to be with you. I've had almost a 10-year partnership through the new climate economy with WRI, and I can attest to the quality of their work and the incredible impact it has, Michelle, around the world. So it's great to hear of your work, and thank you for the support, particularly of women in India. This is very dear to my heart because the model of development has, despite India's wealth, left too many people and particularly women behind in terms of the construction of the economy and the lack of shared prosperity. But let me begin by trying to bring together the challenge of the convergence of crisis, because even before the global pandemic, we had historic levels of inequality. And economies like India, women in particular in India, and young people actually bore the brunt of that, along with many other developing and emerging economies. But even within developed economies, I'm sure Michelle knows that the inequality in countries like hers and mine, being the US and Australia, are also stark. It's just that overall, they have some resilience frameworks that allow people to keep their heads above water. And we'll talk about that. But if you then add the crisis of climate, then this is indeed a challenge, just those two areas of global crisis, to put people and shared prosperity with a new development model that both is inclusive, but also deals with the existential threat to our only home, the planet on which we live. You add COVID-19 and the exposure of the faults in the global economy that just became craters. I only have to say vaccine nationalism, and it will tell you everything anyone needs to know about what is wrong with a world that's just driven by profit and not a world that has humanity at its heart. And then you go to, of course, the impact on from the crisis now in terms of the abhorrence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resulting inflationary price hikes, particularly on food and energy. But again, the cracks in the global economic model, when now we see the barriers to supply chain capacity, and I don't need to labour this. The reality is we have to transition in every sector if we're actually going to meet the test of a carbon-free society. And it's not 2050, it's now. If we don't stabilise the planet by 2030, then we are actually simply out of time. When you add that to the other elements, then there is no other choice but to put people and planet at the heart of our development models, of the way we construct a future that is based on shared prosperity and environmental sustainability. I must say, for women, it is just heartbreaking to know that on every indicator, progress for women has not just stalled, but is in decline. This has to be arrested as a matter of justice, but it also has to be addressed if we're going to ensure social and environmental stability with the resilience to weather further global shocks. Already with the impact of extreme weather events, we are seeing women on the front lines in every area of vulnerability. And of course, with responsibilities for families, the loss of lives and livelihoods is really taking a toll. But if you actually look at the pandemic alone, then women lost $850 billion during the height of the pandemic. That's equivalent to about the GDP of 98 countries. That's a huge price to pay in regard to personal and economic stability. But what's worse is that the majority of women have no access to universal social protection, despite the development research that has proven that this is the most effective foundation for equality, for inclusion, and for growth. If you go to a country like Sweden, our sister will tell you that in the 1890s, Sweden was a very poor country, but they decided to build a social protection system and to actually develop their wealth collectively of shared prosperity. And today it's one of the most equal societies in the world. So, you know, that's just one case study. We could give you many. But indeed, if you think about the lack of resilience, the fact that our labour market is broken when 60% of workers are working informally and the majority of them are women, that means no social protection, no minimum wages, no rule of law. This is, in fact, a level of vulnerability, of precariousness that most people in developed economies simply can't contemplate. It exists, but for the majority of people, they can't contemplate it. And as we face the challenge of climate transition, there's no excuse to continue to put social protection systems on the outer edge. We must put them in place. For women in MSMEs, the vulnerability to domestic and global market risks requires this as a priority. With the failure of many aspects of globalization, the growth of domestic opportunities for micro, small and medium enterprises is an opportunity for women. But it's also important for India to deliver on the twin commitments of development and climate change with the policy framework for these micro and small enterprises that give them the security and the resilience that's vital to the domestic market, to local communities, to the individuals, particularly women themselves, because You know the statistics. There were many in your brief, but I can tell you that India's, you know, if you've got 29% of India's GDP employing more than 110 million workers, and that women's participation in this area of the economy is growing faster than in any other industrial segment, then you have to look at the policy settings. If you're serious about inclusion, if you're serious about equality for women, or if you're just serious about community stability in economic and social terms. It's also true that women are particularly prevalent and own about 20% of the total enterprises. That's a huge slice of domestic ownership of economy, and then the predominance in rural areas is growing markedly. However, many women-led enterprises are, as you know, largely unregistered. They're therefore in the informal economy. It makes them more vulnerable to market and climate risks, and they're more likely to miss out on available government and institutional support. The work of many organisations, many women's organisations in India is indeed exemplary. If you look at our own SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Associations, you can see many case studies where they've taken, you know, women's enterprises, built cooperatives to give them mutual support. They've transferred women using diesel pumps to solar pumps for salt mining, through to building clean cooking solutions with solar, and much, much more. They're also trying to formalise with many of the rest of you childcare, because it's a scandal that care, indeed childcare in particular, but also aged care, and many areas of health carried by the burden of women in their homes are simply informal, not regulated, not paid, and for which there is little or no formal training. So the burden of care needs to be lifted. We know that in the care economy, if you think of health, education, childcare, aged care, other areas of community services, there are millions of jobs if we formalise these areas. But equally, the freedom for women that lifting the burden of care provides to work in other areas of the economy is the fastest multiplier of growth for any society. So what does it require? It requires the partnerships between governments, between enterprises and the people who work there as well. And it requires transparent plans that go to what is the policy framework that actually can create sustainability and security in these enterprises. And what's the, as I said, the resilience foundation being social protection, including those areas of care. But we know, for example, that you need access to capital. You need access to technology and technological knowledge and the IP associated with it. You need to have transparent asset ownership and legal redress for where that's actually trespassed. We know in the agricultural sector, there is a lot of tension at the moment, and it's not just in that sector, but where you've got land ownership or indeed land rental systems being challenged as people think that, you know, bringing large corporations in and simply investing in what's called smart agriculture without the partnerships is actually destroying lives and livelihoods on the front lines and potentially actually not building the sustainability that's necessary. If there was ever an area where we need to address the whole gamut of security, you know, food wastage in itself is extraordinary when people are starving throughout the world. So we need to reconsider what these ecosystems look like and how you build secure work within it. I don't have to tell you that minimum living wages or incomes where there's no dependent relationship are critical. And we've done a lot of work with some of your colleagues in India trying to work out how you intersect the social security system with incomes to make sure there's a minimum living income to actually sustain people who can't actually get enough work or get paid enough for the work they're doing to survive. and of course, mobility and transport. I know I'm coming to the end, so let me say this, that we also need to look at transport systems, at mobility for women to be able to manage work and family because they may need to move from one area to the other. And all of this requires just transition measures. It is what's in the plan. There's got to be consultation. If you take the work of Sheila Patel and the slum dwellers, who I really admire, then, you know, they will tell you that if governments don't partner with the waste pickers, for example, or other enterprises, but rather contract out that businesses to often huge international firms or national firms, then they're actually denying the development and the reality of building the enterprises that the people there started. So consultation, partnership, secure work and incomes, investment in sustainable communities. This is what just transition is, but it starts with actually talking to the people, building the plan together, making sure that people have a confidence that they will be involved. And of course, you already touched on skilling. We describe the demands for this new model of economy as indeed a new social contract: jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs with just transition, universal social protection, a rights-based approach to actually both workplace and legal issues, including workplace safety for women. We want to see universal social protection, equality and inclusion with the realisation of the Sustainable Development Goals for everybody. We need a new development model, and I will finish with telling you that the strength of democracy is important. You know that. India has a strong democratic tradition, but as the World Justice Project will show you, the trend towards authoritarianism in all countries that have otherwise been known for democratic spaces is really something we have to tackle if we're to have the kind of dialogue, partnerships and just transition models that make it possible for people to have the confidence to invest their own work, income and that of their families in enterprises that are secure and sustainable. So good luck. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be able to be part of both listening and learning from you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barrow. Those were some really great insights, and just hearing you speak about this topic really gives us so much further to explore further in this webinar. So on that note, let me now invite Ananya Chakrabarti, who is a senior research analyst at WRI India. Ananya will just provide us with a brief context on the kind of questions that we will then explore in the panel discussion, just trying to bring together all these ideas from Michelle and Sharon into putting it into context for our next session. So over to you, Ananya. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashwini. Niyati, if you could please share the slide. Yeah, could you please go to the third slide? Yeah. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a little, it makes my task a little easier to follow Ms. Barrow because she has kind of laid down the foundations of what I'm going to talk about and discuss in this context setting. Very short introduction. We see that the world is stepping up towards low carbon transition to attain our climate goals. And one of the main, some of the few main transitions that we see is this movement away from high carbon based fossil fuels that have supported industrialization in the past century to more cleaner sources of energy, such as solar, wind, and tidal energy in the coming future. Another important transition that has been occurring right now is also this movement away from the traditional manufacturing process, which by its very definition took raw materials from nature and the earth and turned it into a finished good. However, the link was broken because it was based on a produce and use model. What a new green sustainable process of transition in manufacturing would imply that we are able to reuse the materials that we have extracted, recycle them, upcycle them, and reduce our dependence on extraction of natural resources. Therefore, as businesses and manufacturing units in particular move towards energy efficiency and material resource efficiency, it provides an opportunity to lower cost, brings up new businesses, gives new jobs, and creates new market leaders. Definitely, this transition is naturally going to bring about shifts in the way in which businesses work. And also, it's going to shift the ways in which it impacts the people involved in those businesses, both as owners of small and bigger businesses, as well as the workers who work in those businesses. We see that businesses are going to be changing their energy sources, the technology that they use, the materials. They're going to be moving from more polluting materials to newer and more sustainable materials, maybe come out with newer products and business models. However, what is going to be really, really important for this transition is to understand that for majority of the workers who are involved in this transition needs to be inclusive, mainly for the people who are locked in low income and so-called low-skilled jobs. It is therefore critical to ensure that everyone, like Ms. Barrow pointed, is entitled to productive work with conditions of freedom, equity, security, and dignity, so that this transition is just for everyone. Niyati, could you please move to the next slide? Against this context, we consider the case of the micro, small, and medium enterprises, where we see this transition to be built on the 4 pillars of resilience, decarbonization, just transition, and scaling up. Ms. Barrow has touched upon the need for new technologies, ensuring that finance and credit is there, ensuring that skills, that the workers who are engaged in these sectors are skilled and reskilled, as well as the policy support that is overall needed to ensure that the shift happens. Next slide, please. We see that the Indian MSMEs have a dual relationship with climate change. On one hand, while the MSMEs contribute to climate change, they are also impacted by climate change as well. A recent study in 2021 of MSMEs in India showed that in the last 5 years, 5% of the enterprises had faced the impacts of heat wave, 8% had faced floods, and 11% had faced the impacts of droughts. This had left them credit poor. This had made them lose out on their clientele base. This had also impacted the way they do their own businesses. Therefore, the vulnerability of MSMEs is also exacerbated by these climate risks. And this becomes particularly important when we look at their capacity and financial constraints, because a majority of the SMEs in India are micro in nature. Therefore, even if, like Ms. Barrow pointed out, like there's a huge chunk of people who are working, 110 million people working in this sector, but they have a very small slice of the GDP. Therefore, it's really essential that while we ensure this low carbon transition, it is inclusive and just, and it's inclusive for everyone who's involved in it. Next slide, please. We see that majority within the MSMEs, we see that women form a critical component of the MSMEs. In terms of manufacturing sector, women are mainly located, they are not equitably located across the entire gamut of MSMEs. We see that there's a strong labor market segmentation that occurs, and women are mainly concentrated in the manufacturing jobs such as garments and textiles, handicrafts, and food processing. And they remain absent from other sectors such as automobile and construction, or even if they are there, they are often not there as owners of those enterprises, and their labor contribution to these sectors might also sometimes be underreported and uncounted as well. We find that the 70% of the 15 million women-owned enterprises are mainly located in manufacturing, and women constitute about 24% of the total workforce. Last slide, please, Niyati. Yeah. So against this context, we see that there are broadly 4 major challenges that can be understood. There are traditional gender-based barriers that women continue to face. Women continue to bear a greater responsibility towards social reproductive work. So care work, paid work, as well as unpaid work, which is sometimes termed as a triple burden of work for women. Women continue to take care of, say, routine chores within the household sphere, which continue to be unremunerated. And they continue to juggle these options, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, when women's labor force participation rate really plummeted. We saw that they were actually juggling multiple responsibilities together at the same time. They also come from a point of really unequal capabilities to start off with. For example, almost 59% of the burden of illiteracy in India is borne by women, and women also have really poor health outcomes, as shown by the staggering figure of 66.4% of the anemic people in India being women. We also see that the gender wage gap is really high for women in the country, and they also often have limited access to critical productive resources, such as finances. A recent study indicated that women dependent on microfinance institutions, women are entrepreneurs dependent on microfinance institutions, and however, the size of the loans that they got were often really small, up to 1.5 lakh INR. And also the size of the Mudra loans, that is one of the government schemes that are given to entrepreneurs, for women never went beyond 50,000 rupees. Therefore, it shows that the size and the scale at which women operate often remains really small, and making them more vulnerable to climate risks and any slight shocks in the economy. In addition to this, we often see that women face the lack of knowledge, and women continue to have limited knowledge and skills, and they are often the last ones to be included when a new skill training program is rolled out, or when a new technology is introduced. Most of the technology continues to be designed for men, keeping them in mind. Against this background, it becomes important to consider the policy landscape where women work, where women become entrepreneurs, where women become workers in the MSMEs. We continue to look at issues like legal protection for women, issues of providing childcare, maternity benefits for women entrepreneurs and workers, even in the informal sector. And I hope that today's discussion reflects on a lot of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ananya. And with that, we will move into the panel discussion for today and explore some of the key questions of interest. So in our panel today, we have a great panel of speakers, beginning with Ms. Sabina Devan. Ms. Devan is the founder and executive director of the Just Jobs Network, which she co-founded with John Podesta in 2013. Ms. Devan's research focuses on strategies for job creation and workforce development, and she works closely with governments, businesses, multilateral and grassroots organizations. We also have Dr. Kavya Michael, who is a researcher and postdoc at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. Her current work examines how the various structural elements of gendered injustices and exclusion interact with the impacts of climate change, as well as climate action and the energy transitions across the globe. We also have with us Mr. Ashim Rao, who has over 30 years of experience in the trade union movement and rich association with social, political, and human rights movements. He has been a founding member of many national and international organizations and networks and has been involved in the very inception of the Trade Union for Energy Democracy, which is a global coalition of unionists shaping the union perspective on climate change and policy advocacy for fair transition and energy democracy. We also have Mr. Tarun Shukla, who works at Pan IIT Alumni Research for India Foundation and as a senior Sevak, sourcing and government liaison. He's mainly responsible for securing approvals of financial and funding frameworks from the government of Jharkhand for SPV Preja. He's also responsible for coordinating mobilization activities across Jharkhand and other states for reaching out to over 5,000 poor and underprivileged youth for skill development training and securing assured job placements. We have Sucharita Banerjee, who is a development sector strategist with experience in environmental sustainability, infrastructure, and governance, with community as the primary stakeholder. She focuses on adopting a result-oriented, community-driven strategic approach for campaigns, communications, and policy advocacy. And finally, the session will be moderated by Ms. Ulka Kelkar. Ulka is the director of climate program at WRI India. She's an economist with over more than 2 decades of experience in climate change impacts and policy. So with that, I hand it over to you, Ulka, to take us through the panel discussion.
Thank you, Ashwini. And it's my privilege to moderate this discussion with this inspiring group of people. We are hoping to get through 2 rounds of discussion. The first round will focus on what's the most important part of the problem, and the second round will focus on what might be some of the solutions. So please do excuse me if I request you to be brief, around 3 minutes each, but we'll try to make sure that there's enough discussion. So Sabina, let me start with you first. Sharon spoke about a convergence of crises. How are these affecting the labor market in India, particularly women?
Thanks so much, Ulka. It's been a really stimulating discussion so far, and it's an honor to be here with you all. So as you rightly pointed out, and as Sharon said too, there are several forces: the pandemic, climate change, technological transformation, and all of these forces together are upending labor markets, and they're creating much more uncertainty and introducing insecurity in the world of work for businesses and for workers, right? And this comes against the backdrop in many countries in the global south of large and growing youth populations, right? So in India, for example, the population between the ages of 15 to 29 is around 360 million. That, Ulka, is higher than the population of every individual industrialized country in the world, right? And we have to provide jobs and provide safety nets for that huge sort of growing population. So there's growing upheaval in the labor markets at a time when there's a need to create opportunity, economic opportunity for more people. And this is, this is really a very tricky situation. This is the backdrop for women's employment as well, right? So in India, and again, this is true for many developing countries around the world, the paradox is that women are more educated than ever before. They've reached parity in enrollment in almost all levels of education. And at many levels, their performance, learning outcomes actually exceeds boys, right? Sorry, men. But yet their labor force participation for several years has been declining, and it only recently has stabilized. So now, now we have about 1 out of every 4 women are in the labor market. So the important point here, Ulka, is that female labor force participation, while it's stabilizing, it's not dropping anymore in India. This figure is one of the, in the lowest third relative to other countries in the world. It's an extremely low rate, and it's much lower than that of men, right? And reasons range from time poverty to safety and transportation and at the workplace, or even to, and this is not something we've heard of yet, but even to employers that just don't want to hire women, right? For a range of reasons. My organization, when we do field research, employers will tell us whether it's not wanting to assume liability or assumptions about the fact that they think women are somehow less competent than men are. There's a reluctance to actually hire women. And these are the same kinds of biases that also play into women accessing loans and so on when it comes to entrepreneurship. So when there's a lack of demand in the labor market, and then there's a heightened lack of demand when it comes to women and women's participation in the labor market, our only solution then becomes, oh, well, let's just train women to be entrepreneurs and start their own small businesses. But as I said already, there's problems with getting access to loans and markets, but there's also a whole bunch of other constraints that women face, sociocultural constraints that inhibit women from actually having their own businesses, assuming the risk and then being able to grow those businesses. So entrepreneurship cannot be the knee-jerk solution to these problems for the labor market or for women in particular. I'll just end by saying, Oka, that the problems are significant, they're large, and they're urgent. And I'm hopeful that now there's an increasing conversation around creating appropriate social security systems and investing more in, breaking down silos between education and training systems, and that that we're increasingly realizing that these major forces that are upending labor markets have to be countered with big systemic architectural solutions on providing safety nets and opportunities for progress for more workers. And this is also in the benefit of businesses and the economy at large.
Thanks, Sabina. Kavya, I'll now turn to you. Sabina has talked a lot about the current situation. You're editing a book, in fact, on gender transitions as a result of the low carbon policies. How do you think climate policies might affect gender inclusion and female labor force participation, particularly in the informal economy? Thanks, Kavya.
Thank you so much, Ulka. So I would argue that, climate policy in India is very, very development centered. But then how do we see development? The traditional model of economic development, the development that India has followed is very economic in nature, and social aspects are always sidelined. So climate policy is very reflective of that kind of an approach. So if you divide it into two and look at how gender appears in climate policy, gender is definitely mentioned in India's climate policy, but it is excessively being mentioned in adaptation policy, where there is image of a vulnerable women or a very virtuous woman who's like an environmental champion. So this kind of plays into their biological attributes, and as kind of Sharon alluded, playing into the imagery of women as sole providers of care. So the problem here is policy itself is institutionalizing these gendered norms, making transitions really, really impossible. Whereas if you take the mitigation literature, it's very technical in nature, and where women appears, it's just as beneficiaries of cook stove programs or being energy poor women supplied with some sources of energy, and not necessarily as part of the supply chain. Whereas if you look at the issue of climate change in general and the problems it creates, there is increasing rural-urban migration and women being employed in really precarious situations in the informal economy, and also living in very precarious situations in informal settlements. So this kind of really creates a complicated situation for women, alluding to a looming social reproduction crisis as well. So what happens when transitions take place is these historic injustices that are prevalent in the current system or the current energy regime is just going to get replicated, maybe in new forms to the new transitions regime. So this is where I think a fundamental change in institutionalized gendered norms is really required. Yeah, I will stop here, and I think we're going to talk to the solutions later in the next round. Yeah.
Thanks, Kavya. Thanks very much for pointing that out. And I'll, in fact, take the similar question to Sucharita. Just like we've seen some of the transitions that Kavya spoke about, we are seeing also this surge of activity in the electric mobility sector, in the automotive industry, not just in India, but we're seeing announcements by the United States, by Europe about EV targets. What are some of the gender impacts of such shifts in the auto industry or other industries that you might be tracking? Sucharita?
Yeah, thanks, Sulka. So I will be answering this question from my own experience. We have been doing a lot of interventions in the energy mobility sector in India, various states of India. So my answers will have the foundation in that. So yes, automotive sector, if you look at traditionally it has been a very less gender diverse sector with more the nature of jobs being described as very masculine in nature. It's a very male dominating sector. Electric vehicle manufacturing is no exception to this end. However, with the introduction of automation in electric vehicle manufacturing, it has two sides. On one side, of course, there will be some less manpower will be required because of this automation, but it also implies that there will be less reliance on dealing with the heavy machineries, which mean the nature of job is changing. So there is more scope for incorporating women as a part of the workforce over there. However, we need to see that what kind of jobs will be there for the women, whether it will be on the shop floor or more at the back end jobs like designing, IoT, artificial intelligence, data analysis, machine learning, etc. So I will be talking in terms of gender impact in terms of employment creation. If you look at the EV manufacturing sector, see there are 2-3 kinds of jobs that we see are emerging. One is very highly paid, but requires a lot of skills, high skill, like at the top of the job pyramid, I would say. You need to have specific training for that related to IoT or data analysis, etc. Look at the entrepreneurship setups that are coming up, especially in locations like Bangalore. So you need a lot of training for that, and especially related to STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and maths, which is expected to create almost 80% jobs in a decade's time. So do we have enough provision for the women on this on the required skill training? I believe we are yet to create that space for them. Now, if you look at the dealership who deals with this electric vehicle sales and marketing, yes, the number of women on those setups is increasing, but it is not really sustainable fashion, I would say. And of course, women can be employed in the charging infrastructures, charging stations, or they are actually getting employed as drivers, getting associated with fleet aggregators. And yes, to some extent, these kind of job roles give them a lot of flexibility because as Kavya and Sharon were mentioning, that women are perceived to be the primary caregivers in the family. So COVID had changed a lot of equations in between, because during COVID, a lot of women, from our interaction with a number of stakeholders, we got to know that a lot of women were out of the job market because they were seen as the caregiver to the family. So electric vehicle manufacturing sector was no exception again. Another interesting thing is, in these days, ESG framework and related things are driving the mentality and the business decisions of the industries. So they are increasingly putting a lot of emphasis on having a gender diverse portfolio. Is good, and this is why we see giants like Ola Electric Mobility. They have announced that their future factory will be employing around 10,000 women, and every two-wheeler that comes out of that factory will have a touch of a woman. So hearing all this announcement, let's see how much of that gets materialized. But yes, investor-driven decision plays a crucial role in making the gender role more. But one last problem I would like to highlight is in the EV space, e-mobility space, women workforce, how many of them are there, are yet to get unionized, which is a very critical thing, because unless and until there is a union, there is a collective voice, voicing your concern to the authority concerned, a lot of things are not really addressed until and unless a union, like whether or not the women have access to basic amenities, or about their wages, or any other things that is directly related to their profession, are not really being taken care of. So those are a few issues when we look at the look through the gender lens.
Thank you very much, Sucharita, for raising those issues. I'll now move to Tarun. Tarun, from your experience, if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the opportunities and challenges for skilling the youth, particularly young women, please.
Yeah, so considering this whole topic about environment and climate change, so what we are seeing, there is of late there has been, because of this climate change, it has affected everyone and especially women. If you see now what is happening, lots of green job are coming, and with those there are a lot of opportunity. Now with with our own experience, what we saw. Initially, like when we started all these training center, initially we were training only men. So just to have this note, and somewhere around 2016 we started, we did the first batch of women in garment industry. And that was basically, if you see, the whole issue was about safety and security of the girls, and how actually they'll be dealt if there is any issue, especially a state like Jharkhand, which is very famous for trafficking related issue. So we were very much concerned, and we did that batch. But initially, say for 1 year, we were very much sort of nervous, but ultimately it went well. And now almost 6 years down the line, we are almost 50% of our trainees are almost women. So the key reason what the feedback what we are getting from employer, women are more serious. The retention rate is much better. Almost 90% retention rate in women as compared to men, where actually it's almost 60 to 70%. And they are more diligent, more disciplined. And though I think Sucharita talked about unionism, but because of this reason, because there is less of unionism, the employer are more getting sort of women, and they are more demanding. Just recently, we placed 60 women in Ather, that e-mobility. We knew that it's a new opportunity. In fact, Ather is the first of our employer which actually insisted that they wanted women, not men, and because of their own experience. So a lot of opportunity in green jobs, especially in mobility sector. Then also the solar panels, those are coming up. There are challenges, definitely challenges more of I would say related to safety, the challenges which are generally considered with women. Then the employer's feedback is more about like after 3 or 5 years, because what we are doing, we are training mostly the girls between 18 to 21 years. So once, like after 3 or 4 years, because of the family issues, the pregnancy and delivery, they have to take a break, and that's a setback which actually we still lots of employer and the society has to find a solution. So but there is a break. So there is a major challenge which actually most of the employers feel, also the family members, whether the girls will be able to continue for this job for long, or there can be a serious setback. But then also, if you see the overall scenario in automobile sector, that has also sort of changed. What we saw initially, only they were taking only men, but now when they have started experimenting with women, most of the employers are also not going with 50-50. Even many of the employers are now insisting only women, or say more women. So it's largely, I think, because of the automation. And then there are other benefits, mostly retention and discipline, which actually I think the smartphone age generation which is coming up. So everyone is feeling much more satisfied with the women.
Right.
So I think this is overall, if you see, there are a lot of opportunities in green job, but definitely we need to do more of skilling. So as we talked about earlier, as a family, especially in a poorer family, the families which we work with, they sort of try to spend very less on women education, on women skilling, and somehow the whole program has to be tuned. We need more funding, more government support, where actually, because family would be not spending. So ultimately, at least 1 or 2 generations, say 15 to 20 years, we have to spend hugely on their skilling, on their vocational education. And that is something which society and government has to take the initiative. So with this, I'll close my remarks.
Thank you so much. And I'll move to Ashim. Ashim is someone who's been at the forefront of the labor movement, is all too aware of the existing inequities in the system. How do we make sure that equity and justice are not ignored in the low carbon transition, all of the kinds of trends that the previous speakers have talked about? Love to hear from you. Thanks. You could please unmute yourself. Thanks.
Thanks, Alka. And I'll just take 2 or 3 core points which has been already said by others, but put it in context. Let me put it like, as Sharon has already said, and it was on her leadership that actually the fair transition or just transition, whichever word you want to use, got into the preamble of the Paris Convention and actually brought that as a discourse within the different labor movement and different countries. But essentially, the fair transition is primarily viewed as a transition to green economy. What it means in terms of the industry that is going to collapse or going to die out is something not addressed at all. And in India, that is going to be a very serious challenge, because after all, the transition is equivalent to energy transition. Energy transition also equivalent to coal transition, that you have to get out of the coal over a period of time. Now, there can be debate whether it is 20 years or 10 years or 15 years, but essentially over at least within 2 decades, there will have to be some transition. Now, what is happening is there is an assumption that this transition will happen through the market mechanism and not through a policy-induced framework. And so what happens is that though there is a lot of investment, a lot of institution, a lot of coalition that is coming up to see that the capital investment takes place in the renewable energy, but there's hardly a mechanism or institution that actually addresses the just transition in the coal industry. And this is very, very important, because the inequitable distribution would be so wide. Essentially, let me give an example. Jharkhand, Odisha, and many other are the states which are already poor, what is called the mining area curse of those states. Now, those mining area curse area is going to go through a second curse when they are actually, even their economy will going to collapse, and yet they will not be able to get the investment that is required in for that. And so the cost of transition from the point of people who are going to get adversely affected has to be seriously addressed, and has to be addressed seriously in India, which is so important. That's the one core point, which one can go back, develop it further into what could be the mechanism, and one has talked and written about it, about what would be the best institutional mechanisms that can happen. In fact, it gives us an opportunity. If you look at the coal economy, you can see that the coal economy can be divided into 3 broad frames. There is mining per se. Then there is the people who are dependent upon the coal in terms of their jobs and equivalent job dependency in terms of coal. But there's a larger economy where even households are dependent upon economy that is generated from coal. So if the coal gets closed there, it's just not the coal mining, but it's the coal economy, which is dependent, almost like whole districts and whole talukas in India would actually totally get deindustrialized. And until you have a full-fledged alternative developmental plan, which is being institutionalized there, the alternatives are not going to be very, very serious. And that's what the grim point of view is there. That's the first point. The second key point, which again coming from my own area of garment experience, is that, you see, this is the whole of industrialization, of the new rate of industrialization has taken place, which again has been said by people, at a poverty level wage. And this has to be addressed at some point, because the fast fashion in garment industry has come up because you have low wage producing possibility. Fast fashion can go live with 30% of their stock not being sold, precisely because it's at a very low cost production cost. Unless you increase, so if you want to have a redistribution of the consumption, you also have to have, which is very important for a climate, for us all to become much more, clearer in terms of environmental terms to looking into the new future, then there has to be a kind of redistribution of consumption in some fashion. Now, I'm not talking about people should voluntarily give up their whatever privileges they have. That is another point, which is a moral and political point. But what is more important, that there should be also redistribution of the wages. And if you don't increase the poverty level wages, neither will have community resilience to adapt to the new situation, nor it will force the industry to look into the fast fashion industry like situation and reduce the consumption that is taking place. So these are the 2 broad points that I wanted to kind of make. Thanks for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As the organizers have put in the chat box, we welcome any questions, comments from the audience. The attendees can put their questions in the Q&A box. But let's now move to the second round of discussion. Sharon spoke in her opening remarks about the need for the new social contract, and all of you have touched upon various aspects of these. So let's see if you could highlight some of the solutions that you may have seen in other contexts that are worth trying out and that you would like to prioritize and highlight. So Sabina, let me again start with you. What are some of the most important efforts to ensure better livelihoods for women in the context of the low carbon transition? If you could unmute yourself, please, Sabina. Thanks.
Apologies.
Yes,
Okay,
thanks.
there we go. Because we're talking about specifically about the just transition and the potential for women to own and lead MSMEs that can facilitate and mitigate and help facilitate the transition, let me start with just talking a little bit about MSMEs and then go into what we need to do. So first, in India, there's over 63 million non-agricultural micro, small, and medium enterprises, and they employ about 111 million workers, which is about a fifth of the workforce, right? 80% of these MSMEs are male-owned, and only 20% are female-owned. And when women do own these businesses, a vast majority are micro businesses or own account enterprises. So fewer women own businesses, and when they do own businesses, they tend to be small and they tend to remain small, right? So I want to make 2 points here, Olga, and this picks up a little bit on what Kavya was also talking about, that there tends to be a focus more on the symptoms than the real causes of these problems. We heard a lot about time poverty, that there's a disproportionate burden of care work on women that prevents them from effectively engaging in economic activities, or a lack of access to finance so that women can start and scale businesses, or a lack of access to skills training, right? And when we talk about these issues that are all very real issues, they lend themselves to solutions like let's have childcare or safe transport or increase access to finance. And all of these are very important. So please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying these are not important, but I think they also have to come at the same time with a deep acknowledgement that the root cause is still sociocultural norms that disadvantage women, right? And when we talk about programming, whether it's in the context of a just transition or it's in the context of technological change or the impact of the pandemic on women's livelihoods, at the end of the day, donors, multilateral organizations, governments, there's a huge reluctance to actually call out the importance of addressing these sociocultural mindsets. And unless we do that, particularly at a time when labor markets are being restructured and upended, and there's all this turmoil and turbulence in the labor market, unless we actually start to bring about this kind of mindset change and address the causes rather than just the symptoms, we're not going to see the kind of progress for women that we want to see, in any of these contexts. The second point, which follows from this, is also that, as I said, if women's employment is largely informal, if the extent to which they own businesses, they're small businesses, more women are, of the women that are employed, more are self-employed, right? And this is also a symptom of the overall economy, where 53% of those employed in India are self-employed, right? Which means that our traditional systems of employer-provided safety nets or employer provision of social security or, pension benefits or health benefits, that's breaking down completely to the extent it exists in the first place, right? This idea that, so we have to build systems and we have to build, government provision of social security and safety nets. We have to build government provision of effective skills training that's linked to employer provision. So government either needs to regulate, so employers and, to the extent that we're talking about jobs and those not in self-employment, government needs to regulate so that we have safety nets for workers during this time of turmoil. Or government itself needs to provide universal benefits, whether it's social security or access to skills training and the likes. So I think these important points are really critical. And when we're talking about supporting a just transition, we have to support governments fiscally to be able to provide these, right? So these climate funds and so on, we can't have these ad hoc solutions. The challenge is just too large. It's just too big. We need to have systemic solutions, and those systemic solutions require effective assistance, effective financial assistance. And these small programs that we do are great and useful, but they're not going to address the challenge at the scale that we need in the rapid time frame that we need.
Thanks, Sabina. And so,
Thanks,
Charita, I wonder if I might turn to you with the same sort of question, which is if you could reflect also on some of the structural and systemic issues and what might be some of the policy solutions that are needed.
Yeah, I would reiterate what Sabina said. We have to first identify and acknowledge what are the socio-cultural biases, gender biases, and what are the root causes behind that, whether it is socio-cultural or political, or it has got something to do with the structural discriminations. Then let's move to the different stakeholders and see what role they can play to counter it. First is government. So I feel that all the relevant departments or ministries like the women and child welfare, social welfare, or labor welfare, they should come together, collaborate, and conduct some strong research to come up with data, a strong database that will give us some idea that what kind of impact it is going to have, the clean energy transition is going to have on women participation in the labor force. And that will give us a lot of clarity that how things are going to shape up. Because we, as you were also mentioning in the beginning, we lack the data. Yes, we can see, we can experience, it's right there in front of our eyes, but we need data. Second is, we have to identify on the basis of the database, we have to identify that what are the emerging green jobs, or what are the scopes for further employment. Like we have to identify what are the other labor intensive sectors where the workforce which were out of the job market due to this transition can be absorbed, like other sectors of the economy, other labor intensive sectors of the economy. But the transition will not be seamless. We also have to acknowledge that in order to absorb them back into the job market, we have to reskill them or upgrade the skill set that they have. There comes designing appropriate training modules or skill training programs in a very targeted approach, which is going to be very effective in future. What kind of role that private players can play? Private organizations which are involved in any kind of green jobs, creation of green, they should start assessing the overall picture in terms of what kind of gender roles or gender opportunities are there in this renewable energy related projects. What are the risks? The risks are to be assessed. What kind of job role changes that the women are going to experience, or job role changes or job load changes that women are going to experience, etc. This will also be contributing to the database I was talking about initially. And we have to keep in mind while evaluating everything that, especially in Indian context, women women exert agency only at the local level. But when they go to the next level, whether regional or national, they remain as a very marginalized section with very limited authority when it comes to decision making, especially in a patriarchal setup that we live in. Whether it is related to clean energy transition or any other work-related environment, I would say. So we have to identify, or rather we have to do a bit of hand-holding for this women, especially coming from the lower strata of the society. We have to do a bit of hand-holding so that they are able to utilize the social forums to share their local experience, and on the basis of that, they're able to identify the avenues how to challenge the climate decisions which are not gender diverse or not gender inclusive in nature. So and ultimately, I think all said and done, we have to ensure that there is behavioral shift, or there is shift in socio-cultural norm that shatters or that restricts the participation of women in the labor force. So unless and until that is addressed, I don't think any government intervention or intervention by the private player is going to help much.
Thank you. Tarun, if I might turn to you now to reflect particularly on the role of the private sector. What is their responsibility?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest stakeholder in the whole thing is the private sector, especially the MSME one. What we have observed, in fact, like for a skill training provider, what we try to ensure is that a employer is a just, like they are paying same wages to women. And then the most crucial thing is considering the security part of the girls. Because ultimately the families are concerned about their security, and that's the reason why they are not sending their daughters to join the workforce in a huge way. Also, from employer, we expect there are issues with women health, especially from the regions like Jharkhand, Odisha, where they have low nutrition level, health are sort of not so well, and they have to consider those things also. Many of the employer, what they try to impose attendance incentive, where actually they sort of foresee that all the employees will be coming almost daily, and then they provide some 10-15% incentive on that, so of the wages. So those things actually need to be regulated, considering women aspect. They may not be, especially when they are coming from those poor pockets where they are not getting proper nutrition. We also need to ensure the compliance, there is a competitive and the women are getting a proper sense of growth, and those growths are matching with their life cycle needs. So these are the few things which I think once employers are taking, we as a training provider, we try to engage with them and try to employ more and more girls from this region. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tarun. Ashim, I wonder if I might turn to you now. You've heard a lot about this global support for just energy transition. How could that be leveraged to ensure rights for women? And I could also point out to you one of the questions in the chat box, which is particularly addressed to you and Sharon as well, that what is the role of unionizing in ensuring justice in transitions for the female workforce? If you could unmute yourself, please.
I mean, that's actually to talk about organizing and talk about unionization of the women workforce is an essential, and I think the union movement has to readjust to build that perspective, and I think there can be a lot talked about it. I'm not going to talk about it at the moment, but that's a necessity of any social transition that is going to happen. Now, I at least don't view, and this is what the trade union, TUD is all about, is that we look at the opportunity of the climate crisis as a climate justice framework, but no climate justice can happen without divorcing it from the social justice notion. So I do think that's a second key part of the understanding. Now, I would just give quickly 3 areas in which I am kind of involved and which can be an interesting way of looking at it. I'm not saying that's a solution, but those are all 3 areas that one can think about. First is that MSME, and then again, one can go as you go into small scale home-based workers, and anyone who has worked in India knows to what extent the women workers are involved in that, and to what extent, and I didn't want to really raise that issue here, but to what extent that has been integrated into the global supply chain. Now, if you're going to really think of its integration to global supply chain, you can have no doubt about it that they're going to be super exploitation. I don't want to argue about it, but that's a fact. We all have lived through that experience. The question comes up that can you have a cooperative mechanism which can incentivize the green framework and can change the MSME? Now, this has to be an important ingredient of any transition in the MSME. Just allowing the MSME to give capital investment, to allow for market access, always leads to its formalization and larger integration into the system without allowing a cooperative system to come in, which is an institutional framework that the labor movement has learned where to certain extent economic justice can be sustained. So that's one point which I have. The second point is, if you look at the transition, and again, going back to the coal India, which is the coal area, which is going to be very big, we have to rethink the unit of transition as a core area. And to me, the unit of transition in India is district level. And so district level planning, local area planning, and the experience of DMF, district level minerals from which came from the cess of the minerals, they were all driven back into the local area in some sense. And so a local area development, which means if the analysis and the analysis of the cost, and also the analysis of the transition has to be framed in terms of that. That's the second point which I have. The third and our last point is there's going to be failure. Any transition, but it's 5-10 years, going to be failure. In the end, any transition will become actually societal, from a societal point of view, acceptable if there's a law that allows you to make a transition in a fair way, and a law that does not allow an individual who's going to lose out of it, a justicable framework which is always going to be against the people. And so, and particularly the vulnerable people, the women workers, and everyone, they all will. How much of a best policy we do, there will be losses and there will be people who will be left out. How do they really access justice all over again? So the transition has to be legally framed, and that's why, to me, and I'm involved in all these three areas, to see that actually some mechanism gets evolved to see this transition becomes fair, legally accessible to people, and we can make an equitable distribution. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll go to Kavya for the last comment in this round. Kavya, any examples from any context that you might have seen? And then after you've spoken, I'll request Sharon if she would like to take any of the questions in the Q&A box. There are questions on unionizing, on women's cooperatives, and whether India needs a just transition fund. I'll also request Sabina to reflect on one or two of these questions. But Kavya, over to you, please.
Thank you, Ulka. So I would like to reflect on my recent fieldwork experience in Zanzibar. This is from Barefoot College, Zanzibar, an institution that started in India. So I found a really interesting way in which they were mainstreaming gender concerns into the transitions landscape. Now, Zanzibar being one of the most patriarchal spaces and known for its patriarchy, they basically train rural illiterate women over the age of 35 as solar engineers. Now, a number of training programs like this has failed because they focus only on the technology development part or reskilling part and possibly generation of income. But the unique model that Barefoot College Zanzibar follows is there is, of course, a training module, but there is also another module called Enrich, which kind of focuses on building self-awareness of women, awareness about their rights, about their bodies, reproductive health, and to an extent, conscientization of men also about social norms and power structures. So this kind of an initiative also happens through a unique governance model. There's a very strong hand-in-hand partnership of Barefoot College with the revolutionary government of Zanzibar. So basically, whenever some hindrances are observed, the government steps in right there and there is no delay. So such kind of an approach, I think, can work in the context of transitions, because transitions are also going to be more about decentralized energy systems. So when things are going to get decentralized, there is definitely an opportunity there to tinker with existing power structures. And then this can be scaled up. Of course, it's not to say that the solution should be just restricted to the local space, but you can always scale it up. But the easiest way in which such tinkering can happen is also at these local spaces. So I found this really transformative change in the solar engineers in Zanzibar, who wouldn't even come out of their homes after 6 o'clock, to now being able to command a voice in the society, contesting elections, and to an extent change in power structures also. Because something like generation of electricity in a village or provision of electricity in a village, which was very masculine, has now become feminine. And the way in which the community sees these women has shifted. It's not like a very quick prescriptive solution, but something that would take some time. But I think transitions really provide an opportunity for transformation and integrating gender justice concerns.
Thanks, Kavya.
Thank you.
Sharon, I wonder if you would want to address one of the questions.
So 3 quick points. One is that yes, indeed, you need global funds for some of these initiatives. We have indeed campaigned for a global social protection fund to help the poorest of countries and indeed lower middle income countries, because less than 2% of ODA is actually contributed to the systemic development of social protection. And yet that's the foundation for both a basic economy and resilience. The second point would be that we have to look at all models of economy, as indeed my brother was saying. You know, of course, we organise in major companies, and we are absolutely campaigning for mandated due diligence, for grievance and remedy, or responsibility for the UN business and human rights principles through the supply chains, because the current model of globalisation has been built, quite frankly, on dehumanising exploitation in terms of low wages to produce in the South for the North. That's unacceptable, to build domestic economies. So that risk analysis, but also when you come to just transition, a lot of it will be decentralised. I totally agree with that. It's not that you're not asking, you know, governments and major corporations, again, to take responsibility for a zero carbon plan, inclusive of workers and communities. But we do have to think about what levels of investment, how do we invest in cities and communities to use their procurement powers in order to change the basic model of economy and of energy distribution as a foundation. It astonishes me that, you know, when you hear about the big corporate lobbies and what people will say will work for Africa or India or Asia, you know, it will be different, but people must have a say in it, not just the corporations. And I couldn't agree more on that. On the question of unionisation, well, history tells you if you use collective power, you're going to have far greater capacity to actually, and I think we'd only have to point to the fact that, you know, we were so worried about things like violence, gendered violence, that we have now got a global convention. People are looking at it. In my own country, they've just achieved 10 days of paid domestic family and domestic violence leaves to provide safe havens. You know, there's a whole lot of examples from pay through to policy and legislative guarantees for women that can only be achieved by collective power. So for someone like me to say, yes, unionism, it's obvious, but can I also say that unionism comes in different forms, and cooperatives are just as important for us as traditional structures. My final point would be we need to institutionalise, and somebody raised this. If we don't have just transition institutions that are about energy, but are about also the changes across all sectors that must actually be tackled from both you know, a greater equality model, but also the carbon zero carbon reality, then we're not going to get the people to the table. You're not going to force the pace and scale of the legislation that somebody and the policy implementation that somebody already raised. So these things are in many ways integrated, but we need to act collectively, and we need to have policies that frame both industrial and social priorities so people feel secure, or we're going to continue to have social unrest and political discord.
Thank you. Sabina, we'll give you the last word. If you might want to talk a little bit about cooperatives and also on whether India should have a just transition fund. Thanks.
Sure, Olga, thank you so much. I think a lot of what I wanted to say, Sharon's already said, but I will just emphasize two quick points. One is that, you know, when we talk about a just transition fund, I think the important thing is to realize that we cannot isolate just workers that are affected by climate change or the energy transition and separate them out from a worker that's being affected by technology, right? If a woman loses her job because a factories become automated, it's not that different from a woman that loses her job because of climate change or because of a fossil fuel to renewables transition, right? So again, when we talk about a just transition, it's a transition in it's an economic transition for a large group of workers, and we need to build systemic solutions, right? We need safety nets. We need, as was just mentioned, social protection systems. And these have to come at the sort of universal level for all workers. We cannot isolate these different forces and their impacts. That's point number one. The second point I wanted to make is just, I'm a big believer and supporter of cooperatives. We've seen that our current economic systems have really created enormous inequality and precarity in labor markets, and a winner-take-all system, right? So we need paradigms where workers are direct stakeholders and directly benefit from their own labor. So cooperatives are undoubtedly a part of the solution, but, and there's always a but, the question is that, you know, the cooperative model has been around for a long time. It's not a new model. But why is this phenomenon still the exception rather than the rule, right? And we need to do a lot more to kind of change our economic paradigms and our economic systems toward, you know, accepting more cooperatives and helping build more successful cooperatives. And I think there's a lot of more work that needs to be done on looking at cooperatives 2.0 for a 21st century economy, and how to increase them in number and how to support them and help them grow, so that we can really bring about change in the existing economic paradigm that's deeply problematic, creating unequal societies. So I'll stop there.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Sabina. And indeed, thanks to all the panelists for the depth and complexity of your remarks. We hope to be in touch with you, and all those participants who asked questions and we couldn't take them live, we'll send them to you in writing. But back to you, Ashwini, to wrap up this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulka, and thank you to all our speakers and panelists, as well as the audience who's joined us today. I will not attempt to summarize everything that's been discussed, because we touched upon a lot of issues as well as potential solutions. But I just want to end by saying that this is just the first in many conversations that need to be had, and that we hope to have in the next few months and years. So we will be in touch, and thank you once again to everybody. Have a good evening and good time. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Niyati?